Want to start out this video by letting you know that this video is going to be talking about very heavy spoilers for the video game series Life is Strange. Not only am I talking about the ending of the original series, but I'm also going to be talking about the grand width of the Before the Storm series as well. I want to take this time to let you know that right at the beginning, just so that you can take the time to experience the story in and of yourself before you come and witness this. While I won't be talking about super heavy spoilers when it comes to Before the Storm, I will highlight on a couple things that do emphasize on structural story choices that happened throughout the narrative that was seen in Before the Storm. Just wanted to let you know that. Anyway, let us begin. Most people know that something I enjoy personally is when elements of storytelling are hidden in plain sight, a kind of Easter egg that rewards the viewers for spotting something that they should convert to memory or hold on to for a later time. Doing these kinds of things can be tricky because a lot of the times there's this assumption that audiences may not catch what was attempting to be placed or hidden in plain sight. Sometimes the detail is so minute and obscure that even if you were to watch it multiple times, you may not capture the hints that were being given. Easter eggs in video games tend to be that little bit of information that isn't normally conveyed in a way that makes sense in how it revolves around and goes into the narrative. Instead, these are things that are usually referred to as references to other mediums or perhaps even other titles. However, when you hide something inside of a game that actually helps develop the story in a way that it isn't obtrusive and gets jumbled up in the narrative in that scene, I believe that this is the way that you can do Easter egg narrative bumps in the most perfect way. If that player takes the time to find these elements on their own by exploring the world that they're currently in, then they have awarded themselves by taking the time to find these little elements. Perhaps they can even tell their friends about this thing that they found that helps better explain the story of what's going on. A really good example from the last couple of years would actually be the video game series Five Nights at Freddy's, most particularly in the first game of the series and how on a surface level it was just about a game about surviving, until you took the time to look around and find these details that helped establish the grander story of what was going on. But let's leave the animatronics aside for right now. Perhaps I'll tackle that in another video. For now, we're actually going to dive back into a series that was my first episode of Story Surgery, the choose-your-own-adventure style game that I love to love and despise to hate, Square Enix and Don't Nod Entertainment's game, Life is Strange. Now, as I've said, I've already tackled this game series on this channel before, talking about how I believe the ending was a little lackluster in terms of how all the ideas that it had presented and how I think it could have gone in a different direction, and basically see what we could do to reimagine that. Find out ways that you can keep this sci-fi fantasy element alive. If you want to watch it for yourself, I would definitely appreciate it. Just a heads up though, I really hadn't perfected my format quite yet. I was still kind of figuring it out back then. Long story short, I wish that there was more things that the first season of Life is Strange could have, should have, or would have done differently. Then came the confirmation that we were going to get a prequel series following the life of Chloe Price, the supporting character of Max Caulfield from the first season. Now, I like Chloe as much as anyone else can. I did feel that there were times when she was just a little overboard, but I did like Max and Chloe's chemistry. While the trope of the straight and narrow character being paired up with a rough around the edges character has been done to death, it's basically the plot of most buddy cop films. But with that added benefit of Max and Chloe having history, it added a level of characterization that worked to the story's benefit. However, the idea that a game was going to be about Chloe in a time before Max's return to Arcadia Bay, I was pretty skeptical, actually. I didn't know if Chloe had enough to her character to really carry her as well as Max did because, well, Max had the ability to control time, which is what made the original idea of Life is Strange so appealing to me. Unless there's something else going on, Chloe doesn't have anything like that that would make her an interest in the series compared to her friend. Now, there were a couple of instances, especially in the first episode, that led me to believe that there was something deeper in the narrative going on here. Maybe there was something supernatural about the world this game takes place in, specifically in Arcadia Bay. But unfortunately, this prequel, just like the last episode of the first season, really didn't answer anything. To make it more awkward, Before the Storm presents a lot of ideas that don't actually go anywhere. In fact, almost all the things that happened in Before the Storm are things that you could have pieced together on your own by playing the first season, or just things that were kind of already alluded to through dialogue exchanges. Which leads me to the point I want to address, a question for this particular episode. What was the point of Before the Storm? In a story sense, what was the goal? In the first season of Life is Strange, it did an elaborate job of explaining how slivers of science fiction can be integrated into a larger plot point that doesn't necessarily revolve around science fiction, for better or worse. Before the Storm, as a prequel series, did nothing but regurgitate information that we already knew and discovered on our own from the first season. It's not like we didn't know that Rachel and Chloe were close and intimate as a couple, and us witnessing the relationship doesn't impact our revelations that we had in the first season. Nor does it change the outcome. I feel really bad because if Before the Storm was the first season of Life is Strange, with Max and her time travel adventures being the second series, I'd actually be far more on board with Before the Storm being a part of this franchise. It could have set up details that would have complemented Max's story. Unfortunately, that's not what happened, and Before the Storm just gave us a story that we already knew happened in one way or another. This really does run into a really big problem that Before the Storm had, being that this game was, well, pointless. What did this story actually do for us in a narrative sense? What information did it give us that we didn't already know that would be beneficial to us sitting down and playing this prequel? I'll illustrate my point here, and I'll give you an example to help you understand what I'm talking about. Star Wars. Love it, hate it, it doesn't matter. We're gonna talk about the one thing that most people don't like to discuss, being the prequels. Oh, quiet down, this is important. The prequels were created to allow people to see how one of the biggest villains in cinema history was created, to learn the backstory of how they became what they are. Now, a lot of people like going on record and saying things like, the prequel series were completely unnecessary because you already know how it ends. Well, yeah, this is true for the most part. We do know who became Darth Vader, but what we didn't know is how they became Darth Vader. It's delightfully vague in terms of how this information was delivered to us. In A New Hope, Obi-Wan Kenobi doesn't openly say what life was like back then, didn't explain in detail what events had transpired, instead keeping it very short. Honestly, because of this explanation that we're given, the prequels were a thing that were allowed to happen. Like it or not, the prequels did exactly what they were set out to do, explain where Darth Vader came from and the relationship between him and Obi-Wan Kenobi. You got that in the prequels. I'll give you another example. The Hobbit. No. I'm not talking about the movies. Get that out of here. I'm talking about the book by J.R.R. Tolkien that actually was written before the Lord of the Rings series. A lot of people would only know the Lord of the Rings in terms of how it connects to The Hobbit because they watched the movies or gained general interest after being acquainted with the story in the series. The Hobbit sets up the idea of how the ring is in Bilbo Baggins' possession and the trials and tribulations that came around to him having it as well. While it doesn't necessarily give all the details that would leave somebody to transition into the Lord of the Rings, it does give a genuine and realistic understanding as to why a hobbit would have the one ring to rule them all. Not to mention that The Hobbit was only a single book, one story that focuses on one idea. This book was not required in order to get into reading or watching the Lord of the Rings series, but it did allow you to understand one particular element of the lore in this world, as well as find a connection between characters who seemed to have some sort of history in Lord of the Rings. It was a story that stood tall on its own while connecting itself to the rest of this series. Did you just seriously make a tall joke about a hobbit? Crap, I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. Coming back to Before the Storm, I'll ask you this again. What did this game actually do? What goal did it have with its narrative? Was it supposed to tell us about what Chloe's life was like before Max came back and shortly after she lost her dad? If that's the case, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but we don't need a whole game to explain this. It's not intriguing, it's not gripping, it doesn't add anything to the world of this franchise. Chloe's emotional tone throughout the first season of Life is Strange, as well as verbal exposition that she gives, explains what life was like back then. It's more than enough to get us, the player, as well as Max, to understand what she was going through. We don't need a 3-part game to show us what doesn't need to be shown. Now, some people argue that maybe this game was to show Chloe's relationship with Rachel Amber, a person that was first referenced in the first season and now is given full characterization in this prequel. Now, this is something you could base a premise of a prequel off of, except there's one glaring problem. We know what happens to Rachel Amber. We know her fate. which means that unless this game delivers super powerful detail that would heighten her inevitable conclusion and connect some story elements together, then Before the Storm is still pointless. Rachel Amber is not Darth Vader. We don't have any superficial information that can be presented to us, and if there is none, then it's pointless. Honestly, unless some element of sci-fi is written into this, there is no reason for Before the Storm to exist at all. And I know there are gonna be those people who say, but this game wasn't about science fiction, it's a coming-of-age story. I hate this argument because I strongly disagree with this statement. In my head, this argument is made invalid the moment the writers made the concept of time manipulation, chronokinesis, a part of the world of Life is Strange. You made characters that are aware that this is a thing they had control of, are aware of, and can utilize to their advantage. The moment you make the characters aware of this, it's canonical to the world and is important to the plot. If this rewind power was excluded from the story in that the player was aware that there is time travel and no one else in the game is, that means that we'd have a true point-and-click adventure that wouldn't have any science fiction. Time travel is something that is only aware to the player and no one else. There are two terms I want you to be familiar with in terms of audio-visual mediums and storytelling, such as TV, video games, and film. These two terms are diegetic and non-diegetic. Both of these terms are usually given to auditory elements in storytelling, but they can apply to any visual element as well. Diegetic elements are heard and seen by the characters within a story. This can be a radio playing a song in a scene, a sign displaying the temperature, the sound of a car driving by, the sound of characters talking to one another. These are elements that are a part of the story that the characters are a part of. It's in the world, and ergo, the characters are aware that they are there. Then you have non-diegetic elements, which are, as you probably guessed, things that are not a part of the world but are still part of the story. This would be the soundtrack or musical score, the title sequences and text on screen that tell us the location or information, or subtitles showing what language is being translated into what the audience can understand, or the suspenseful sound effect that are used to get you to jump in horror movies. You know which ones I'm talking about. These are things that cannot be seen or heard by the characters we are following around in this story, but we can. In video gaming, this is usually something like the heads-up display or HUD, something that is given to us on the screen that the characters in the game cannot actually see. This can be a health meter or a breathing apparatus that shows us how long this character can hold their breath. These are things we can see, but the characters and the inhabitants of the game that we're seeing cannot see. Now, there are times when it can be a combination of both, where elements can be used to help the player see information without it taking up too much space on screen or even in the plot. An example of this that I always love talking about would be the video game series Dead Space. It used the idea of making a diegetic and non-diegetic element a part of the world, in that the suits that these characters have are actually displaying their life meter to us, the audience, letting us know how many more hits that this character can take before they die. It allows us to focus in and see how this is still a part of the world that we are a part of without it taking up too much information on screen. It isn't distracting. Now, with Life is Strange, the concept of manipulating time is something that the characters are mentally and physically aware of as an element in this story, which makes time manipulation diegetic to this world. Non-diegetic time travel would be something that is only a gameplay mechanic and is never integrated into the story. The characters in the narrative are unaware that the player can go back and change events and actions by choice. An example of something like this would be reverting to a save state, quitting the game and going back to a save file so that the player could replay the same stage and make a different choice. This is not actually a part of the game, and in which case, when it comes to the story in terms of how this quote-unquote time travel element of using save states is non-diegetic, the characters inside this game are unaware of what you're doing. Now, a notable example of a game that actually does have diegetic plot points with saving and loading the game incorporated into the story would actually be Toby Fox's game, Undertale. If you want to find out what I mean, please go play it or watch a playthrough for yourself. I highly recommend it. Getting back to Before the Storm, it's hard to figure out what the narrative point was with these 3 episodes. Telling a story about Chloe and Rachel's life together before Max's return is a nice idea and would be interesting to find out, but it shouldn't be given to us in 3 full-length prequel episodes. The reason why I bring up diegetic and non-diegetic story elements is because I believe that Before the Storm's story should have actually been hidden throughout the first season of Life is Strange, and I think it would have been better if it was done this way. How, you might ask? Well, let's brainstorm it together. It's time to begin the operation. We know that Before the Storm takes place in May of 2010, 3 years before Max returns to Arcadia Bay and the beginning of the first season of Life is Strange. Because this game rewarded players with little bits of backstory by going through and examining things around the area, let's use that as an example. We know that Chloe and Max really liked to record themselves with tapes when they were younger, given to us by the farewell episode in the last element of Before the Storm, so what if we were to use this to our advantage? What if Chloe had a vlog series that she did for herself as a means to cope with Max being gone and her losing her dad? Vlogging was on the rise in 2010, and Chloe attempting to create one would allow us to willingly dive back into 3 years ago. This game is all about time manipulation. Having Chloe have a secret vlog would work wonders in helping us and Max understand what happened to Chloe in a more technical way. Heck, if there was a new video on Chloe's computer every time you visited her room would be a neat way of showing this element to us. Every time you visit the Price household, there's a new video somewhere on Chloe's computer every time. Or perhaps there are several vlogs on USB drives hidden all throughout the town, maybe at school, maybe in the Price household that you can find every time you visit. Heck, Chloe was a student at Blackwell. Maybe you could find several USBs or videos that are found somewhere in the school. I would imagine that Rachel would also very much be a part of these videos, as Chloe states that they hung out almost every day, and Rachel, being a thespian, was probably really into the idea of being filmed. It's a neat way to show Chloe's life without encroaching on the story of Max and Chloe in the first season. By doing this, it also allows Max and the player to pseudo-meet Rachel in a way. She becomes a real character to us. Instead of hearing Chloe's exposition on what Rachel was like, we actually get to see the videos detailing on what their relationship was like and what Chloe was like back then. This kind of hidden backstory and exposition is completely optional to the player, and is only rewarded to those Easter egg hunters with knowledge and want to find out what is going on, the history of how Chloe's attachment to Rachel is, as well as give us a voice and a face to the name that is shoved at us constantly in the first season. We get to see Rachel Amber. It also adds weight to our experience when we find out that she's been dead all this time. The voice and video of this Rachel we see is a ghost that's been gone for quite some time. Okay, I need to, I don't know if this is a rant section. I guess I'll play the little jingle.
We take a brief moment to allow EPZ to kind of discuss the element of a particular scene in the first episode of Life is Strange Before the Storm.
And begin!
Okay, originally I was going to end the episode, but there was one elephant in the room that I really wanted to address, something that was bugging me intensely throughout the entire playthrough of Before the Storm. It's at the end of the first episode where we get this scene. When I first saw this scene, I thought sci-fi was back on the menu. Another power was being brought into this game that would help us make a connection to the rest of the series. Something that builds on the idea of Arcadia Bay being this supernatural location, there being combinations of mysteries going on all over the place. This is exactly what I wanted. A deeper sense of narrative, because this is what made me fall in love with the idea of this series. Supernatural flakes being sprinkled just within. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. This was actually just supposed to be a metaphor, an exaggeration of emotions that Rachel Amber was feeling. It's never brought up again, and that bugs me. I finished the entire season combing through every single episode trying to see if there was anything else going on, and lo and behold, there was nothing. The thing that Rachel Amber did right here was just supposed to be an emotional sequence. I've read articles about it, had conversations about it, the works. I don't think that was actually supposed to be the intention, because there's two things I want you to focus on. First is the effect that they added to her scream. Second, look at the visual effects that happened while she's screaming. Visually and audibly, everything about this scene contradicts it being just an emotional sequence, and it makes no sense. The effects on screen only become visual when she's screaming, and the way her voice reverberates and has this echoing effect sounds supernatural. Now, I've had arguments with people who just say that it's supposed to be a metaphorical scene, but they don't give any reason for me to believe why they think that is, because they can't explain the direction and a visual and audio sense that leads you to believe that what you just witnessed was something unnatural. I legitimately believe that there was a plotline involving Rachel Amber having some sort of supernatural power, much like Max in her time manipulation. I've loved hearing and reading people's theories that maybe Rachel was some kind of banshee or had some sort of weather manipulation that was motivated by her emotions. In the original episode of Story Surgery that I did on Life is Strange, I imagined a situation where Rachel Amber actually also had the ability to manipulate time. And now that I played through Before the Storm, I think her having weather manipulation works perfectly fine in this scenario. After the end of episode 1 of Before the Storm, I thought that was the direction that they were going to be heading. The way that Chloe reacted to what was going on, it didn't seem like she was just witnessing, this romantic interest being really emotional. Chloe looked like she's just witnessing somebody catching an entire forest on fire with just her voice. Now, I realize that there are people who dislike the idea of Rachel having powers, and that's perfectly fine. I am totally understanding as to why you feel like she shouldn't. So I'm actually going to do you one better, and I'm actually going to make this ending scene in the first episode way more appropriate to this idea. I'm actually going to remove the hints and ideas that there's a supernatural element going on here. The easiest way to fix this is to have Rachel kick the trash can over and let the music be the only thing we hear. A moment where we can see her in total anguish, but it's silenced from the music on top of everything. There's no visual effects emphasizing the wind, there's no reverberating scream, it's just the music and nothing more. I went ahead and recut this scene with only the music playing without any sound effects. I really want to use the original music, but because I don't want to get copyright struck halfway to Hades, I decided to just kind of slow the pitch down a little bit just to make it a little bit more on its own. In any case, here's my re-edited scene of the ending of episode 1.
Come on.
I feel like this version of this scene carries much more weight to it. It's more emotional in its symbolism without there being any misleading visual elements or auditory elements. It's just a moment where you're witnessing somebody you just met in the lowest point they've ever been. I can't help but think that Rachel having a power was a part of some original script that got partially removed, which is why I think the screaming scene is still in this game and is never really addressed. I repeat what I said in my first episode on Season 1 of Life is Strange. If this series wasn't aiming to be a sci-fi thriller, then why are there so many sci-fi elements and ideas of sci-fi introduced sporadically throughout this series? Especially when you make them a plot point. Why would sci-fi be introduced but never utilized? In conclusion, I say this. Life is Strange Before the Storm was a story that should have been incorporated and hidden within the first season's narrative that would have allowed us, ergo Max, to witness a relationship that would inevitably guide the direction of this narrative. Yes, I personally wish that there was more superpowers in Before the Storm, but I understand that that's not the direction that the developers and story writers wanted to take it, and I can completely respect that. You can make this story have nothing to do with powers, and at the end of the day, the problem is that Before the Storm's story was so small that it could have just been easily added in the first series, and that the player could have discovered while snooping around this town, finding little bits of lore and history that would have had more impact the more things that you'd find. If it had a hidden vlog series that Chloe had done, it would have allowed Max and the player to know Rachel as a person, not just as a lost object that's never really given its time to shine. It's a clever way of allowing the character who can control time and travel to alternate realities to dive into a past that isn't their own. A past that really never got the chance to live. Hello everyone, and thank you for watching this particular episode of Story Surgery. Wanting to talk about Before the Storm for a little while now, and being able to get it all out of my head and kind of illustrate ways that I feel like they could have tackled story elements in this particular episode was really my goal. I feel like little tiny tidbits here and there could have been elaborated upon or better emphasized in certain areas. The idea of having a vlog of some kind in the first season detailing what Chloe's life was back 3 years ago I thought was a really neat idea of being able to time travel without time traveling. Apart from that, I have a couple episodes already lined up in production already. The next one that's going to be coming up is definitely going to be one of my bigger episodes, and it's actually going to be the first one where I'm actually talking about literature. While yes, the actual media itself has actually been made into several films, I'm more or less just talking about the story in general. I'll talk about the books mainly, while also diving into the movies a little bit. But apart from that, thank you very much for getting to the very end of this episode. My name is EPZ379, and I'll see you for the next operation.